Okinawa, June 1945. Hot wind knifes across the coral plain, carrying smoke from field kitchens and the sour tang of spent cordite. Behind the wire of a freshly built stockade, hundreds of Japanese prisoners shuffle forward, sunburned faces hollow from weeks underground. Mess sergeants ladle from steaming vats, white bread stacks in neat towers. A grill hisses as meat patties crackle and drip onto steel. Tin mugs knock against each other, filled with coffee the color of dark earth. Military police watch from the catwalks. A Nisei interpreter stands by the gate, noting names, units, wounds. On the road beyond, a deuce and a half unloads wooden cases stamped bottled beverages for the GI canteen up the hill. The first prisoners hesitate, eyes fixed on the plate. Then hands tremble, a bite is taken, and a smell of warm fat and yeast seems to unmake the last month. Some men stare at the bread as if it might vanish. One lowers his head, and shoulders shake. Not from fear now, but from a release he cannot control. This is not the cruelty they were taught to expect. It is something else, and it arrives in the shape of a meal. To understand why this moment lands with such force, we have to see the war and its rules that brought them to this line. The Pacific War reached its middle years under a hard truth. Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. From the jungles of New Guinea to the reefs of Tarawa, U.S. patrols found bodies, not prisoners. Training and doctrine inside the Imperial Japanese Army framed capture as dishonor. Field orders invoked gyokusai, honorable annihilation, rather than capitulation. Propaganda on both sides reinforced the idea that mercy was unlikely. Many Japanese troops believed Americans tortured captives. Many Americans assumed surrender would be a ruse. In that climate, a mess line behind a U.S. wire fence, steam, bread, meat, coffee, was not the ending most men imagined in 1942. The pattern broke only gradually. On Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, on New Guinea's north coast, handfuls of wounded or disoriented Japanese were brought in by Marine and Army units, guarded and interrogated by Military Intelligence Service Nisei linguists. At Tarawa in 1943, barely a dozen Japanese soldiers survived to be counted as prisoners. Saipan in mid-1944 produced larger numbers, both soldiers and civilians, under circumstances marked by despair and mass suicides. Iwo Jima's 1945 defense still yielded only a few hundred military prisoners. Okinawa, confronted by overwhelming U.S. firepower and the collapse of organized command, finally delivered thousands into U.S. custody. By then, systems the United States had built for Axis POWs in Europe and at home were ready to be applied at scale in the Pacific. The legal frame mattered. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which demanded humane custody, adequate rations, medical care, and protections from violence and public curiosity. Japan had signed but not ratified that convention, and adherence in practice varied widely. Washington made a conscious choice: extend Geneva standards to Japanese captives regardless of reciprocity. The policy was moral and strategic: demonstrate American standards, preserve Allied credibility, and encourage surrender by making the alternative to death comprehensible and safe. Execution fell to the Provost Marshal General's office, working with theater commanders in the Pacific. Major General Allen W. Gullion and, from 1944, Major General Archer L. Lurch codified how POWs were to be processed, guarded, fed, and employed. Manuals specified rations comparable to those of base troops, discipline for abuses, and pathways for labor under supervision. The International Committee of the Red Cross inspected many stateside camps and reviewed reports. In forward areas, access was limited by combat, but commanders were still held to the same standards. The message down the chain was consistent: feed prisoners properly, treat them by the book, record what happens. This did not make captivity gentle. Frontline enclosures, temporary cages behind core lines, were rough by definition. Barbed wire, hasty latrines, slit trenches, a field kitchen or two, medical triage under canvas. The first days were about survival and control. Yet even there, the normalization began with a plate. U.S. doctrine required food, water, and first aid to stabilize captives for interrogation and transfer. Nisei linguists acted as bridges, explaining rules, calming crowds, gathering basic data. Behind them, quartermaster units and kitchen crews tried to translate policy into calories. Further back, in places like Honouliuli on Oahu, permanent structures brought routine. Honouliuli housed a mix of internees and POWs, Japanese, German, and others, under military guard. Stateside camps, where small numbers of Japanese prisoners were eventually held under Provost Marshal General oversight, operated on schedules, roll call, work details, meals, canteens with controlled purchases, access to mail. ICRC delegates recorded conditions. Army inspectors tallied rations, sanitation, and discipline. The United States wanted to show that procedure and restraint, not vengeance, defined its custody. Motives layered. Humane treatment aligned with logistics. Well-fed prisoners were healthier, more manageable, and more useful for labor. It supported intelligence. Calmer captives yielded better interrogations. It fed psychological operations. Leaflets and loudspeakers could promise food and safety with credibility. It also served a longer view. Every camp was an exhibit of American power married to rules, a contrast to the atrocities emerging from Burma, the Philippines, and the home islands prison camps, where American, British, Australian, and Dutch prisoners had suffered and died in large numbers under Japanese control. The weight of indoctrination did not disappear at the wire. Many Japanese POWs arrived expecting beatings, summary execution, or starvation. Instead, they were fingerprinted, questioned, deloused, and fed. The first hot drink, the first soft slice of white bread, the taste of meat not from a dwindling cache underground, but from a U.S. field kitchen, these were shocks in sequence. The calories helped restore men physically. The routine started to reframe what America meant. That was not an accident. It was policy flowing through a vast apparatus of supply, enforced by discipline and checked when possible. By outside eyes, by mid-1945, the scale of captures on Okinawa would push these procedures hard. The 10th Army's stockades filled. Mess lines lengthened. Logistics took center stage. In the end, what a prisoner experienced came down to what the system could deliver. Bread, meat, coffee, sometimes a taste of the wider American camp culture beyond the fence. To see how policy became flavor, how a promise turned into soup, bread, and occasionally a bottled sweetness. We have to follow the pipeline that made American meals possible in a war zone. The taste began far from the wire. It started in depots, on docks, and in the holds of Liberty and Victory ships. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps fed millions of men across 2 oceans by segmenting reality into rations and tonnage. Fresh foods when possible, canned and dehydrated when not. Cold chains extended by reefers, refrigerated ships and truck trailers brought meat and dairy forward as ports opened. Water purification units made coffee and soup safe even on coral. Field bakeries turned flour and yeast into the white loaves that showed up on mess lines from Bougainville to Okinawa. The ration system defined the menu. A rations drew on fresh, perishable foods near established bases. B rations used canned and dehydrated components that mess teams combined into hot meals. C rations were individual tins, meat and beans, stew, hash, when kitchens could not operate. K and D rations were short-term solutions, compact, calorie-dense, and utilitarian. For groups, the 10-in-1 ration offered variety in bulk. In stabilized rear areas and permanent camps, cooks aimed for A or B rations, which meant hot food, bread, and coffee as a baseline. The Army cook's manuals of the period included ground beef dishes, hamburger steak with onions among them, because a patty was fast to portion and easy to finish on a griddle or in a pan. On Okinawa, the system unfurled as beaches became ports, Hagushi's shore dumps stacked with crates and fuel. Buckner Bay's anchorage filled with cargo ships swinging at anchor, while LSTs shuttled trucks ashore. Quartermaster companies laid out ration dumps under camouflage netting. Refrigeration arrived progressively, first from ships' holds to insulated trucks, then into improvised cold rooms ashore. When the 10th Army fenced temporary enclosures for prisoners, field kitchens often sat just behind the wire, fed by the same pipeline as nearby U.S. units. Early meals could be basic: stews and hash, hot coffee, bread from field ovens. But they were hot, regular, and counted. Hawaii's Honouliuli camp and other rear facilities translated doctrine into routine. There, permanent mess halls, bakeries, and storerooms allowed a predictable diet. U.S. inspectors monitored calories and variety. ICRC delegates, where admitted, recorded whether rations were adequate and whether prisoners could purchase items from canteens. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention framework, POW canteens were standard. Profits went into prisoner welfare funds, and stock could include toiletries, stationery, tobacco, and, when supply permitted, candy or soft drinks. Purchases were controlled, often using camp scrip or credited wages from authorized work details. The American flavor that POWs noticed, white bread, beef, coffee, sugar, was the product of industrial abundance. Sugar and flour arrived in bulk. Dehydrated potatoes and eggs extended menus. Coffee, roasted and ground in the United States, came forward in large tins and became a near constant in cup and kettle. In hospitals and convalescent wards, powdered milk supplemented the diet. For men who had subsisted on cave-stored rice, captured cans, or nothing at all, these textures and tastes signaled not just nutrition, but scale. Soft drinks belonged to a parallel track. The Coca-Cola wartime bottling program, authorized for the morale of U.S. troops, built and staffed dozens of bottling plants within reach of combat theaters by 1944 to 1945. In the Pacific, plants operated in Australia and spread northward through New Guinea. The Philippines and the Marianas as airfields and depots took shape. Crates of bottles reached frontline exchanges and unit canteens when shipping allowed. The system was designed for GIs, not for prisoners. But proximity mattered. POW enclosures often stood near American camps and service areas. Prisoners saw the crates, heard the clink of glass, and sometimes, under controlled circumstances, through camp canteens, medical wards, or special distributions, tasted the same sweet. Carbonated signal of American logistics. It was not universal and not guaranteed, but it happened often enough to be noticed and remembered. Geography-shaped experience. Many Japanese POWs remained in island stockades, Okinawa, Guam, Saipan, until repatriation after the surrender. Others were transferred to Hawaii for longer-term custody. A smaller number were transported to the continental United States and held at established POW installations under the Provost Marshal General's oversight. In all of these places, food tracked the local supply situation. On forward islands, menus reflected what ships could deliver and what kitchens could handle under canvas. In Hawaii and stateside, rations resembled base area fare, with predictable bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee. Where canteens stocked soft drinks or sweets, access for prisoners was regulated but real. None of this was improvised charity. It was policy translated into practice through tables, timetables, and tonnage. Quartermaster officers calculated calories per prisoner per day. Medical officers tracked weight gain after capture. Commanders judged security against humanity and found that order improved when meals were regular and clear rules held. Interpreters explained the routine, lining up, washing before meals, returning utensils. The first encounters with American food, therefore, were not simply moments of appetite. They were the opening moves in a larger program to stabilize, interrogate, and manage thousands who had been taught that surrender ended in cruelty. Even the architecture of the mess line carried meaning. Bread in stacks, meat portioned visibly, one for each plate, coffee poured to the brim. In some rear camps, a canteen window with a posted price list. For men who had lived on rumor and fear, the regularity was disarming. It matched the promises printed on Allied surrender leaflets and broadcast from loudspeakers and made them plausible. It also gave intelligence officers and interrogators a starting point with men who could finally sleep and think. The pipeline, then, was more than supply. It was a bridge. It connected legal commitments in Washington to a steel ladle on a coral plain, and beyond that, to a perception that the enemy was powerful precisely because he could afford to be measured. That intersection, policy, logistics, psychology, and culture, formed the stage on which individual reactions played out. From here, we can look at those reactions and the systems around them from different angles. The human shock of the first meal, the tactical use of food in surrender appeals, the leadership choices that set standards, and the moral terrain that defined what it meant to feed a captive. Human hunger arrives first as noise. Stomachs cramp, eyes dull. Then the line forms and steam lifts from a vat. The plate is warm in the hand. White bread yields at a pinch. The first swallow hurts because the throat is raw. Medical officers note cracked lips and weight loss. Kitchen crews cut portions to a standard, the same scoop for each man, to quiet the fearful scramble that ruins order. A nice interpreter points to the wash station, to the return bin for utensils, to the next tent for dressings and quinine. Routine begins to take shape. The surprise lives in details. Sugar in coffee, fat in meat, milk in a hospital mug, mouth sores ease. Sleep returns. Camp doctors record gains of several pounds within weeks for those who arrive severely undernourished. Some prisoners eat mechanically, eyes fixed on the table. Some glance at guards, waiting for a blow that does not come. Others lower their heads and breathe in, steadying themselves with both hands on the tin tray. Rumor dissolves when the second meal comes on time, and the next. The line also restores memory. The smell of yeast recalls pre-war kitchens in Kyushu or Hokkaido. A can of peaches in syrup slips across a ward table and lights a row of faces. The human response to nourishment is immediate and visible, and in these camps it becomes a shared language. Guards manage the crowd with patience because the procedure works. Interpreters answer questions about work details and mail because men who have eaten can listen. The first hot meal lessens fear and opens a narrow space where rules can be explained and kept. Tactical and psychological operations food is a message. Allied loudspeakers on Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa promised humane treatment, medical care, and meals for those who surrendered. Leaflets printed in Japanese described how to approach the lines safely and what to expect. Disarmament, processing, rations, and transport to the rear. The words mattered more when the reality matched them. When a prisoner steps into an enclosure and receives the drink and bread he was told to expect, the promise gains weight in the minds of those still outside. American planners understood this linkage. The Allied translator and interpreter section worked with theater psychological warfare units to craft scripts that used simple terms, food, water, safety, rather than abstract arguments. Captured prisoners sometimes repeated these points in monitored statements, noting that they had been fed and treated. Reports from late 1944 into 1945 show surrender rates rising in certain sectors after sustained appeals and the collapse of organized command. Terrain, unit culture, and immediate danger still dominated choices, but the credibility of rations and care tipped marginal cases toward survival. Canteens and visible abundance added an unintended layer. Even when soft drinks were reserved for GIs, crates stacked near a wire fence spoke to scale. A system that could feed thousands daily and still deliver treats to its own troops was a system that could afford to keep its word. Interrogators and civil affairs officers benefited. Men who had eaten and slept were more coherent in questioning and more receptive to instructions about sanitation, work assignments, and repatriation procedures. The tactical result was quieter stockades and more useful intelligence, achieved without violating the laws that governed custody. Technological and logistical, the mess line is a machine. Field ranges roar on gasoline. Bakers in portable ovens turn out racks of loaves before dawn. Quartermaster clerks count tins, sacks, and carcasses, moving from ship to truck, to dump to kitchen. Refrigeration extends reach. When refrigerated barges and trucks begin to cycle reliably, meat arrives chilled rather than salted. That is the difference between stew from a can and a patty finished on a griddle. Menus follow manuals. The Army Cook's Handbook lists ground beef dishes because patties are efficient to portion, quick to cook, and easy to hold warm. 10-in-1 ration packs supply bulk components, meat, vegetables, desserts, that a team can turn into a hot meal for a small group. In rear camps, A and B rations allow staples that define the American table. White bread from field bakeries, coffee from large tins, butter or margarine when available, jam, canned fruit. Prisoners notice not only the taste, but the regularity. The same items reappear, a sign that behind the fence stands a grid of depots, schedules, and ships. Soft drinks trace a separate network built for troop morale. Bottling plants follow the advance, feeding post exchanges and unit canteens. Glass clinks in wooden crates. For prisoners, access varies by camp policy and supply. But the presence of those crates within sight of the wire carries its own message. The technology of abundance, refrigeration units, powder mixers, bottle washers, translates into sensory experience. Cold, sweet, fizzy. Even when prisoners do not receive a bottle, they see how Americans live in war. And that sight helps define the boundaries within which camp leaders can keep order. Leadership decides how far those boundaries extend, which brings the focus from kitchens and pamphlets to the policies and cultures that shaped every meal and rule. Leadership and policy standards begin at the top and are enforced at the gate. In Washington, General George C. Marshall's War Department expected the Geneva Convention to be honored across theaters. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur each controlled vast commands where frontline violence was severe. But their staffs issued orders that POWs were to be taken into custody, processed, and fed according to U.S. law and international obligations. The Provost Marshal General's office translated policy into daily routines: identification, medical triage, rations, labor rules, and discipline for guards. Manuals, such as the 1940 Rules of Land Warfare and PMGO directives, fixed the principle that humane treatment was not a gesture. It was a requirement. Compliance depended on reinforcement. Inspector General teams and theater provost marshals circulated to audit camps. Commanders emphasized that order and security improved when the book was followed. Feed men, treat wounds, lay down transparent rules. The International Committee of the Red Cross, where access was possible, primarily in the United States and Hawaii, served as both witness and pressure. Reports on calories and sanitation moved up chains of command. Where abuses surfaced, investigations and courts-martial followed. Uneven in pace, but real enough to warn the line that policy would be defended in law, not rhetoric. Leadership also linked standards to strategy. By 1944, Allied leaflets promised food and care to those who surrendered. That promise only worked if the mess line matched the text. Headquarters briefed psychological warfare teams and interrogators that consistency mattered. If a prisoner met the routine he had been told to expect, the next man, still in a cave, might consider the same choice. This sense of instrumental humanity, ethics that also served operational ends, kept kitchens supplied and guards trained even when hatred was fresh. In that calculus, a hamburger patty on a tray or a cup of sweet coffee was not charity. It was policy in visible form, enforced by officers who understood that the measure of American power was discipline as much as firepower or rent code. The Imperial Army's Senjin-kun, the field service code issued in 1941, taught soldiers that capture was shame. Training invoked older ideals of Bushido filtered through modern nationalism. Surrender, recruits were told, invited torture and dishonor. Battlefield rumor magnified fear. Reports of Allied fury after Tarawa and Peleliu fed the conviction that mercy did not exist. Many soldiers learned almost nothing about Western food or camp life. Bread was occasional at home. Coffee and carbonated drinks were novelties, not daily habits. For troops who had eaten rice when they could, roots and rats when they could not, the taste of white bread and beef was a jolt strong enough to cut through indoctrination. The shock begins as contradiction. The first hours in custody deliver procedures, not blows, delousing, a medical look at wounds, a ladle over a plate. The senses report what the mind resists: sugar in a hot drink, meat fat melting on the tongue, a nurse checking temperature in a hospital tent. A visible, repeatable order: line up, eat, rest, that echoes none of the warnings about barbarity. Men who had been told they would be beaten are instead told where to wash their hands. The result is cognitive dissonance with a physical component. Weight returns, headaches ease. Sleep stretches across the first uninterrupted night in weeks. With the body steadied, the next thought arrives. Perhaps the leaflets were not lies. This reframe did not erase loyalty or end resistance. Many prisoners remained guarded in speech and action. Some refused to answer questions beyond name and rank. Others clung to shame and feared homecoming more than captivity. But the experience of food and care, mundane, repeated, undeniable, rewrote a corner of the map inside their minds. The enemy was rich, yes, but also ruled by rules. The plate and the cup were the first stable facts in a new and unwanted world. And for a portion of those men, they became the first seeds of a grudging, private curiosity about the America they had been taught to hate. Moral and comparative terrain. No theater in the Second World War was free of cruelty. The Pacific saw atrocities from island to island, and surrender could be lethal in moments of chaos. Individual U.S. units committed unlawful killings. Some were punished, others not. The record is uneven, and honesty requires the admission. Yet the systemic pattern of U.S. custody, documented rations, standard medical care, and the presence of external inspectors where permitted, differs starkly from the treatment many Allied prisoners received under Japanese control. The Bataan Death March, the brutality along the Burma-Thailand Railway, starvation rations, and the routine of beatings and forced labor cast long shadows. American policymakers knew this contrast. They did not copy it. They chose to hold to the Geneva norms and to make that choice visible in daily practice. The moral choice carried practical benefits. Humane custody reduced disease and violence inside camps, stabilized labor details, and improved the quality of intelligence obtained. It also created a reserve of credibility that psychological operations could draw upon without descending into fiction. In the fog of war, truth has an unusual power. When a leaflet promises food and a man later eats it, the next leaflet is no longer just paper. That truth, however, demanded constant work. Discipline at the wire, audits in the mess, and punishment for violations were not occasional gestures. They were the ongoing cost of staying inside the law while fighting an enemy whose own adherence varied and often failed. Comparisons must also account for the American home front's contradictions. Japanese American citizens suffered internment under Executive Order 9066, a grave injustice recognized later by law. That policy did not govern POW treatment, but it forms part of the landscape in which these choices were made. Within POW systems, standards held more consistently. The question, "Why feed the enemy well?" met answers rooted in law, strategy, and identity. America aimed to win, and to win in a way that could be defended afterward. A steady plate in a prison stockade was part of that defense. These angles, policy, culture, and morality only gain clarity when tested at scale. That test came on Okinawa, where tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians left caves and ravines for the wire, and where the U.S. system was forced to turn principle into practice hour by hour. Okinawa forced the system into the open. In May 1945, the Shuri Line cracked under weeks of bombardment and rain. The 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, with Lieutenant General Isamu Cho as Chief of Staff, slipped south through caves and ravines. American units moved over ruined ridges and flooded paddies. Shuri Castle lay in rubble by 29 May. The fight did not end. It changed shape. Organized resistance thinned into pockets. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were driven toward the peninsula's narrowing tail. 10th Army kept its plan intact. Lieutenant General Simon Believer Buckner, Jr. ran a two-corps battle, 3 amphibious corps on the west, 24th Corps on the east, with Kadena and Yontan airfields anchoring supply and evacuation. Military police strung wire for temporary stockades behind the advancing lines. Quartermaster units followed with field kitchens and water points. Nisei linguists moved with G2 and psychological warfare teams, loudspeakers packed into jeeps, leaflet bags slung behind seats. The order was consistent: accept surrender when possible, secure captives, and process them under the rules already laid down. The first enclosures filled from 2 streams. One stream was sudden, small groups waving white cloth, guided forward by Marines or Army infantry who had mastered the motions of disarming, searching, and escorting without losing tempo. The other was gradual, wounded carried out of caves, medics negotiating access under fire, and civilians emerging with children first, hands open and faces blank with exhaustion. In both cases, custody began with the same steps. Hands on heads, weapons discarded in a growing pile, a quick frisk for grenades and pistols, a line formed in front of a table, names, units, ranks, recorded to the extent memory allowed, delousing powder, bandages if needed, then a ladle over a plate. The difference between death and survival tasted like heat and fat. In the spring mud of Okinawa, B rations and captured kitchens met. Stew, hash, beans with meat, coffee poured from steaming kettles, bread sliced from field bakery loaves. Kitchen sergeants, trained to portion with discipline, kept the queue steady. Medical officers marked down the obvious: jaundice, malaria, dysentery, weight loss far beyond what a uniform could hide. The focus stayed on control without cruelty. Guards kept men moving. Interpreters repeated rules through a bullhorn. The scene was wartime order, not charity. But for prisoners braced for blows, the first plate set down in front of them felt like a contradiction made real. By early June, numbers made the change visible. Reports tallied thousands of military prisoners and tens of thousands of civilians in custody by campaign's end. More entered the system daily as pockets collapsed. Stockades were enlarged with additional strands of wire and fresh towers. Corps collected captives into larger compounds near the airfields. Camp routines tightened. Roll call, mess, medical triage, questioning, and transfer to rear areas. The scale pulled the quartermaster forward. Refrigerated trucks shuttled from beach dumps inland. Bakery companies turned out racks of loaves before dawn. When weather allowed, supply ships anchored in Buckner Bay fed the grid ashore. and the grid fed every fenced rectangle within reach. The fighting did not pause for any of this. On 18th of June, as troops pressed south toward the last ridges, Buckner was killed by enemy artillery. Command passed to Marine General Roy Geiger. 4 days later, organized Japanese resistance ended. Ushijima and Cho committed suicide rather than surrender. On 23rd of June, the 10th Army would be commanded by General Joseph W. Stilwell. The wire and the kitchens kept working through the changes. The battle's end did not empty the stockades. It packed them tighter with men who had run out of ammunition, food, or orders. Psychological warfare adapted to the new landscape. Leaflets explained surrender procedures in simple, repetitive terms. Walk forward unarmed by daylight. Carry a white flag. You will be fed and treated. Prisoners testified to care in controlled broadcasts. In valleys where caves still held armed holdouts, loudspeakers carried promises across wet rock. Credibility depended on the mess line. When those who stepped into the wire found the bread, meat, and hot drink described, word spread through captured notebooks, through new arrivals, through civilian intermediaries who moved between lines gathering relatives. The ethos of Gyokusai did not vanish. Many chose suicide. Many others yielded when starvation and illness overtook resolve, and when the shape of American custody, visible, disciplined, and predictable, came into focus. Details fixed themselves in memory. White bread that tore at a touch. Meat patties fried on griddles when supply permitted, as cooks looked for the fastest way to portion protein to hundreds at once. Coffee so strong it felt medicinal. In hospital tents and rear wards, milk powder reconstituted for those too weak to chew. In the larger depots, canteens for American troops stocked cigarettes, candy, and bottled soft drinks sent forward from bottling plants established in the Marianas and the Philippines. Crates at a distance clinked with glass. Prisoners noticed. In certain camps, where regulations and supply allowed, limited canteen purchases by POWs were supervised. In medical wards, a bottled drink might appear as part of convalescence. The experience was not universal, but it was real enough to enter recollection. A first cold, sweet swallow that tasted like a different world. For guards and camp officers, the human wave required a balance of firmness and care. Every meal was an exercise in crowd control. Every distribution needed clarity. Procedures were taught and retaught through interpreters and hand gestures. No weapons in line. Wash before eating. Return utensils. The routine reduced friction. It also prepared men for the next stage. Transport to rear camps in Okinawa's Central Plain, then onward to holding facilities in Guam or Hawaii for longer-term custody and labor details. The transition from frontline cage to structured camp life deepened the sense of order that the first hot meal had started. Intelligence officers worked parallel to the kitchens. Interrogations took place once patients were stabilized. Units, routes, supply conditions, morale, and orders, these were the questions. The answers grew more coherent with food and sleep. A prisoner who had eaten was less likely to collapse mid-sentence. Medical officers measured the same change by numbers. Average daily calories rose. Men put on weight. Cases of beriberi and pellagra responded to diet. In logbooks and monthly reports, the transformation showed up in terms, rations issued, pounds gained, days to convalescence that read as clinical. Behind those numbers lay a simpler sequence: shock, heat, salt, sugar, sleep, and a body that began to trust survival again. Events at the top framed the conclusion. By late June, 10th Army declared organized resistance ended. Stragglers remained. Pockets of holdouts fought on. The wire now enclosed a cross-section of the defeated army and of the island's civilian population. The rules that had guided the first mess line turned into a daily rhythm for thousands. Within that rhythm, the sensory markers of American abundance, bread, meat, coffee, and occasionally a bottled sweetness, continued their quiet work. The campaign's end on Okinawa became a hinge. Ahead lay surrender on the home islands, mass capitulations, and the conversion of wartime stockades into repatriation pipelines. For prisoners and guards alike, the routine begun under fire would carry into the uneasy peace that followed. The gunfire thins, but the system does not sleep. On 15th of August 1945, radios crackle with the Emperor's voice. Word filters down unevenly across the Pacific. Cease hostilities. Lay down arms. Await orders. In caves and stockades, it means the same thing in different ways. For Japanese prisoners already behind the wire on Okinawa, the routine tightens into predictability. Meals on schedule, medical checks, interrogations, and work details. For those still scattered across islands and garrisons, it means columns of men moving into custody, with white cloths tied to sticks. The fear of ambush replaced by the embarrassment of being counted. Holding points expand to absorb the flow. Guam becomes a hub, its depots stacked with rations, and its airfields filling with transport. In Manila, the vast complex of U.S. Army service units turns into a clearinghouse for surrenders across the Philippines. In Hawaii, Honolulu and other facilities set aside barracks space as transfers arrive from forward areas. The categories shift as well. Wartime prisoners remain under POW rules. Surrendered personnel after 15 August are processed under occupation authority. The distinction matters to lawyers and paymasters, but in the mess line, the ladle moves the same way. Stateside transfers remain the exception, not the rule. A small number of Japanese POWs travel under guard to the continental United States for extended custody and labor details, including farm work and depot tasks, at sites like Fort McCoy in Wisconsin and a handful of other installations under the Provost Marshal General's supervision. There, the routines resemble those at large German and Italian camps. Roll call, work, mail, canteens with controlled purchases, the presence of ICRC delegates, and inspections that count calories as carefully as they count head and bed. For the majority held in the Pacific, the experience is nearer to the theater they fought in. Heat, canvas, coral dust, and kitchens that keep time with ship schedules and air cargo. The symbolism of American abundance grows more visible as combat fades. PX warehouses near occupation staging areas fill with cigarettes, candy, and the glass-bottled promise of soft drinks. The Coca-Cola wartime system, created for troop morale and already operating from plants in Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Marianas, delivers pallets of bottles to exchanges wherever roads and forklifts can work. The program is not designed for prisoners, and distribution to POWs is never guaranteed. Yet proximity dissolves walls. Sick or recovering prisoners in hospital wards sometimes receive a bottle from medical staff. In certain rear camps, limited purchases flow through camp canteens under supervision. For a prisoner who has lived months on rice scraped from the bottom of a pot and rainwater boiled in a shell casing, a cold, sweet drink is not just sugar. It is a sensory proof that the enemy is organized to the point of casual luxury. Repatriation takes shape in paperwork and ships. The war's end brings surrendered enemy personnel to assembly points where embarkation lists thicken. U.S. and Allied authorities coordinate with newly empowered Japanese liaison officers to route men home. The ports of return on the home islands, Yokohama and nearby Uraga in the Kanto region, Kure and Ujina in Hiroshima Prefecture, Sasebo in Kyushu and others become funnels, receiving liberty ships and transports loaded with men who step down gangways clutching blankets and cardboard suitcases. On board, the same routine prevails: cooked meals at sea, medical checks, and a controlled handover upon arrival. The process stretches across late 1945 and well into 1946 as shipping and occupation priorities permit. Within the camps, time dilates. Days become fragments, inspection, work detail, mess, mail call. Interpreters moderate expectations. Not all rumors are kind. Some prisoners fear the shame that awaits them at home. Others worry about families they have not heard from since 1944. The kitchens remain the one constant that turns fear into something manageable. Bread arrives in stacks. Meat appears on a schedule. Coffee stays hot in galvanized urns. In hospital tents, powder dissolves in water to make milk for men with ulcers and for those whose teeth have loosened from months of vitamin deficiency. The body accepts this order before the mind does. Weight returns in increments noted in medical charts. A man who could not walk far from the wire in May can carry a crate by September. Intelligence work continues. Quieter now. Interrogators shift from urgent tactical questions to broader inquiries about unit structures, training, industrial capacities, and doctrine. Some prisoners open up after weeks of predictable care. Others hold fast to silence. The absence of violence in the routine matters. It drains urgency from resistance. A system that neither starves nor humiliates can wait. Ask the same question tomorrow, and get a more accurate answer because the body that must recall it is not shaking. The contrast between expectations and reality remains sharp. Many prisoners arrive having absorbed stories of captured Allied troops brutalized in the Philippines and on the Burma-Thailand Railway. American guards absorb their own news. Photographs from liberated camps in the Philippines, survivor accounts that sear. The U.S. system holds to its course anyway. Investigations into guard misconduct continue when allegations arise. Courts-martial and reprimands underscore a point that commanders repeat in clean briefings. Order is the point, and disorder begins with hunger or rage at the fence. The kitchen crew, hardly noticed in a battle narrative, becomes the mechanism that keeps both sides away from the edge. Civilians thread through the scene. On Okinawa, tens of thousands of islanders processed through civilian compounds receive rations, medical aid, and, as the island stabilizes, work on reconstruction projects. Their experience is separate from POW custody, but often adjacent. Families watch American cookhouses and learn the schedule of hot meals and bread distribution. The image of organized abundance persists in their memories as well. In some places, American units run small canteens where civilians can purchase surplus items. In others, black markets bloom, carrying candy, canned meat, and, when a bottle can be slipped past the fence or the gate, a taste of the American sweet drink that glows in the sun. By the winter of 1945-1946, the system begins to unwind. The number of Japanese prisoners in U.S. custody falls as repatriation accelerates. The wire remains for those awaiting transport or for those held longer due to specific cases. Kitchen routines taper as head counts drop. Medical officers discharge patients with careful notes about diet and recovery. The final mess lines feel both ordinary and historic. Another plate, another cup, and then a name called for a ship that will take a man back to a country reshaping itself under occupation. What began amid smoke and mud ends on a dock with a manifest and an escort to a gangway. Men return with restored weight and changed expectations, carrying a memory that is both simple and difficult to explain. The moment when fear gave way to the warmth of a plate and the sweetness of a drink in a place they had been taught to dread. Hamburgers split along two paths, one old, one new. The Meiji-era hambagu, a patty served with rice or bread, remains a home and diner staple. The American hamburger sandwich, wrapped in paper and eaten in the hand, grows with base towns and post-war diners that aim at GIs first and then discover a local clientele. In port cities and neighborhoods outside the wire, grills turn out patties for customers who have learned the taste from work, from black market stalls, or from stories told by men who spent months under U.S. guard. When formal chains arrive in the 1950s and 1960s, they do not introduce the flavor. They organize it, For former POWs, the occupation is a quiet test of memory. Many do not speak openly of surrender. Shame and silence remain common, especially in the immediate post-war years. But when asked decades later, by historians, in oral histories, in prefectural archives, details of food appear with precision. The first hot meal in a stockade, the march to a mess tent, the surprise of milk in a hospital cup, the day a nurse set down a bottle cold enough to sweat. These memories do not erase what came before: combat, loss, and the brutal calculus of a war that consumed everything it touched. They do, however, anchor the moment when the enemy's rules made room for a different kind of survival. Strategists in Washington and Tokyo study a related lesson. Humane treatment in wartime had not been sentimental. It had been instrumental and lawful. In the Cold War that follows, the United States refines the same linkage in doctrine and training. Promise fair treatment, keep the promise, and use the credibility to draw opponents out of hopeless fights. The template appears again in later conflicts, in the form of loudspeaker appeals, safe conduct passes, and visible medical and ration support. The specifics change. The logic holds. The domestic imprint in Japan is measured in habits rather than speeches. Bread shares the table with rice. Coffee becomes a morning scent from Hokkaido to Kyushu. Western dishes settle into family menus alongside simmered fish and miso soup. Soft drinks, once glimpsed through a fence, move into shops and vending machines in the high-growth years. None of this can be traced to a single mess line, a single bottle, or a single camp. Yet, there is a line of influence running through the simple facts of custody in 1944-1946. Exposure, routine, and the power of predictable abundance to soften binaries that ideology had hardened. There were contradictions that never untied. The same occupying authority that kept POW kitchens on schedule also presided over a devastated landscape, where hunger lingered and rationing endured. The same United States that followed Geneva rules in custody had interned its own Japanese-American citizens during the war. A clear account holds both truths. Against that background, the decision to feed prisoners well and to let the world inspect the ledger stands out not as a perfect act, but as a deliberate constraint that bent the arc of outcomes toward order. By 1952, the occupation ends. Bases remain. Memories settle. For the men who once stood behind a wire with a plate in their hands, the taste of that first American meal becomes a fixed point on a map that otherwise shifts and blurs with time. For the societies that fought, the episode sits inside larger stories of defeat, recovery, and alliance. And for students of war, it offers a compact lesson on means and ends, that a kitchen can enforce a promise better than a slogan, and that the smallest unit of order is sometimes a single, steady ladle. The opening scene still waits for its answer. A man who expected cruelty tasted warmth and wept. The question that lingers is not what he ate, but what that taste did to his idea of the enemy, and what it still means when nations choose to win by keeping their word. The first hot meal behind the wire turned fear into something else, not into gratitude and not into friendship, into order. The smell of yeast, the weight of a patty on a tin plate, the bitter heat of coffee. These were small facts that contradicted months of rumor. They were also the simplest expression of a decision made far away, to bind American power to rules and to make those rules tangible in the body of a captive. What happened in those lines was not sentimental. It was technical and moral at once. Logistics pushed bread and meat across oceans. Law fixed a standard that could be audited by strangers with notebooks. Discipline made the routine repeatable even when anger pressed at the gate. Together they produced a kind of proof that propaganda alone could never supply. One measured scoop became a message. The enemy would keep his word, even here. That message carried past the war. It helped untie men from the fatalism that had shadowed them in caves and ravines. It strengthened the credibility of loudspeaker appeals and safe conduct leaflets. not because they were cleverly written, but because they were true in practice. It set a template that later militaries would relearn, that humane custody is not a luxury but a multiplier, turning information, labor, and stability from strained improvisations into routine. The echoes in civilian life were quieter. In occupied Japan, bread joined rice, coffee joined tea, and Western-style dishes found new footing as industry and supply recovered. Soft drinks that had been glimpsed through fences or hospital doors gained a legal marketplace in the years that followed. None of this can be traced to a single camp. Yet, many of the men who tasted these things first in captivity carried home a memory that framed the post-war encounter with American abundance. Rules made visible, and a sweetness that arrived after scarcity. Standing again in that Okinawa stockade, the scene resolves into its parts. Wire, watchtowers, interpreters, a field range roaring, steam lifting into hot air. A prisoner steadies his hands and eats. He does not change sides. He recalibrates the world. In that pause, the war loses a little of its total claim on him, and a different future, disciplined, imperfect, but survivable, begins to take shape in the warmth from a plate and the calm that follows. From here, the consequences unfold, on paper in numbers and audits, and in private through that testimonies efface in barracks, in letters, and decades later in memoirs and interviews. Numbers close the battle and open the ledger. On 23rd of June 1945, 10th Army declared organized resistance on Okinawa finished. The price was written in hard totals: roughly 12,500 Americans killed or missing, more than 36,000 wounded. Japanese military dead ran well above 90,000, with thousands more buried in caves or lost to the sea. U.S. counts of military prisoners settled in the low thousands, orders of magnitude higher than Iwo Jima or Tarawa, yet still small against the army that had fought to annihilation. Civilian suffering dwarfed both columns. Well over 100,000 Okinawan civilians died amid bombardment, fire, and displacement, while tens of thousands entered U.S. care in guarded compounds that fed and treated non-combatants alongside the newly captured. For the American system that had promised fair treatment, Okinawa became a proof of concept. The provost marshal general's inspectors and theater provosts traced supply against need, calories per head, infirmary beds, weight changes in the malnourished. Quartermaster ledgers show A and B rations reaching rear camps with predictability once the anchorages stabilized, while B rations and 10-in-1 components kept frontline stockades supplied in the weeks between the fall of Shuri and the final collapses on the Kian Peninsula. Medical officers recorded a pattern that now reads as a statistic, but then felt like rescue. Edema receding with better protein, beriberi responding to vitaminized diets, average weight climbing after the first 10 days in custody. Compliance with law was measured in audits as well as meals. The United States continued to apply 1929 Geneva Convention standards to Japanese captives without demanding reciprocity. In Hawaii and the continental United States, International Committee of the Red Cross delegates visited camps, examined kitchens, and filed reports on diet adequacy, sanitation, and discipline. Theater inspectors in the Pacific, where combat had limited neutral access, compiled parallel reviews and forwarded them up the chain. Where misconduct surfaced, assaults at the wire, rough handling in transit, investigations followed, with reprimands or courts-martial to enforce a principle repeated in orders. Custody would be firm and legal, and the mess line would run to schedule. The intelligence value of humane routine showed up in the tempo of questioning. On Okinawa, interrogators found that coherent answers usually arrived after calories and sleep. Unit designations, artillery ammunition expenditure, cave layouts, supply shortfalls, details that mattered in the last weeks of the campaign were easier to extract from men no longer shaking with hunger. After the surrender, the questions shifted to doctrine, training, and industry. Reports compiled by G2 sections and the Allied Translator and Interpreter Service cite the same advantages. A settled routine and predictable meals produced better information over time than fear ever had. Labor and wages followed the rulebook. Under Geneva norms, eligible POWs could be assigned work not directly tied to combat operations, paid a set wage, credited to camp accounts. In rear areas and stateside camps, Japanese prisoners cut brush, harvested crops under guard, repaired roads, and carried out depot tasks. Canteens run under the POW Welfare Fund model allowed supervised purchases of toiletries, stationery, tobacco, and, depending on local supply, sweets or soft drinks. Access varied by theater and period, but the structure was consistent. A closed economy inside the wire that turned wages into small comforts under watchful eyes. Repatriation began as a flow and became a tidal movement after August. By mid-August 1945, the Emperor's broadcast reshaped the map. Prisoners of war and surrendered enemy personnel were processed along parallel legal tracks, but the practical outcome converged: medical screening, cataloging, staging, and transport. In the Philippines, Manila drew in surrenders from the archipelago. Guam served the Central Pacific. In Japan, ports at Yokohama, Uraga, Kure, Ujina, Sasebo, and Hakata turned into funnels. Liberty and Victory ships lifted men by the tens of thousands. U.S. Navy and Army Transport Service runs stitched islands to home waters. Most Japanese prisoners in U.S. custody were home by late 1946, with exceptions for those held as witnesses, for war crimes proceedings, or for longer rehabilitation. The symbolic cargo that traveled with them was smaller than a duffel bag and heavier than a crate. It was memory. Many returned to a defeated country, having eaten foods that had been rare or unknown in their pre-war lives: soft white bread, meat prepared in patties or stews, coffee poured at nearly every meal. A few had sipped a cold, bottled soft drink in a hospital ward, or purchased sweets through a camp canteen. This was not universal. It was not guaranteed, but it happened often enough to fix an image of American scale and regularity in men who had been conditioned to expect the worst. When post-war interviewers asked about captivity, the answers veered from shame to surprise, and then, often, to the concrete. The first hot meal, the bread that tore at a touch, the steady rhythm of the line. The strategic calculus behind these routines became clearer in peace than it ever could under fire. The United States could point to records, inspection reports, ration tables, medical logs, to demonstrate that it had held to the law even while fighting an enemy whose treatment of Allied captives had often violated it. That contrast mattered in diplomacy and in occupation. It also mattered to the work of disarmament and reconstruction. A prisoner who had experienced order and predictable meals was easier to process, to ship, and to hand over to Japanese authorities at repatriation centers now under Allied supervision. The routine that began with a ladle over a plate on a coral plain reappeared on docks, on transport ships, and in assembly camps under SCAP control. The human scale remained uneven. Some ex-POWs feared going home to families who might treat surrender as a stain that no amount of survival could wash out. Others carried illnesses and wounds that would shape their lives. Yet even here, the American system's emphasis on medical care and diet left measurable traces: weight regained before the voyage, diseases treated, teeth and ulcers stabilized with milk and vitaminized foods. Those were not acts of charity. They were the continuation of a policy that paired discipline with abundance and found that together they closed. A war with fewer additional deaths than neglect would have produced. What these men carried back would soon meet and occupied. Japan, where Allied bases, post exchanges, and civilian markets began to translate wartime rations into peacetime tastes, and where brands and dishes once glimpsed through a fence or a ward door would step into daily life. Peace arrives as rules, not silence. Under the supreme commander for the Allied powers, occupation authority begins to reorder daily life in Japan. Bases ring the map: Yokosuka and Atsugi on Tokyo Bay, Yokota inland, Sasebo in Kyushu, and airfields reborn across Honshu. Okinawa becomes a garrisoned hinge between the United States and Asia. Near every gate, commerce wakes. Japanese contractors, laborers, and shopkeepers step into a new economy tied to the habits of American troops. Smells and signs follow: frying fat, coffee on a hot plate, English lettering on crates. Food aid widens the lane. Wheat flows under Allied relief programs. School lunches expand with bread, powdered milk, and canned goods, first in cities damaged by firebombing, and then nationwide as law and logistics catch up. White loaves, shokupan, become a routine slice on plates that had once held rice by default. Western-style dishes that predated the war, yoshoku like hambagu, hamburger steak, croquettes, and curry rice, find new momentum when ingredients are no longer scarce and when stoves can run again without fear of air raid sirens. The memory carried home by former prisoners blends into this shift. Soft bread that tears at a touch. Meat shaped into a patty instead of shaved into a soup. Canteens and post-exchanges deepen the imprint. During the occupation years, PX warehouses stock sweets, canned meat, and cigarettes for U.S. service members. Japanese civilians do not shop there, but proximity matters. Japanese employees on bases see the stock move. Some items leak into the black markets, the yami-ichi, that spring up around stations and alleys. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, canned fruit, and tins of coffee appear under canvas. The sight reshapes appetite and ambition long before formal retail returns. It also plants a clear association. American power arrives with rules, trucks, and things that taste sweet or rich after years of scarcity. Soft drinks trace the same arc. First, inside the fence. Wartime bottling plants had followed the flag for troop morale. After 1945, bottling for U.S. forces continues in occupied Japan and nearby hubs, with sales restricted to exchanges and clubs. Civilians encounter the glass bottles as employees, as musicians, as contractors, and in the shadow economy that thrives wherever supply meets want. Formal civilian distribution comes later, in the late 1950s, when the company establishes a commercial foothold and legal bottling for the Japanese market begins in earnest. By then, the brand is not a stranger. It is a familiar silhouette from gate towns and base clubs, a taste linked to uniforms, jeeps, and the idea that cold sweetness can be a daily habit.